Hey everybody, today we're going to continue with the Protestant Reformation. So if you would like to follow along, this is Lecture 2, the Protestant Reformation. And what we're going to do is kind of look at how the Reformation spread to other countries in Europe. We'll look at Switzerland, England, Scotland, and then we'll kind of see how the Catholics responded to a lot of this stuff going on. So when we look at Switzerland, there's two people that we are focusing on, Huldrych Zwingli and John Calvin. Now, Switzerland is a very geographically rugged country. It's very decentralized. There's 13 provinces in Switzerland that are loosely confederated with each other into this federal republic. Basically, the provinces regulate their internal affairs, but there's a common legislature that regulates foreign affairs. And in Switzerland, you have pretty much the same problems that went on in Germany. Priests are taking concubines, prostitutes, having children out of wedlock. Priests gamble, priests get drunk. Priests are focused on worldly, not spiritual affairs. Now, Zwingli is born in the village of Wildhaus. He's very well educated. He went to a Latin school when he was 10 years old. He goes to the University of Vienna at age 14. He receives a humanist education. And basically what that means is he reads the Greek and the Roman classics, so the Iliad, the Odyssey, Virgil's Aeneid. So he's very well versed in kind of pagan literature. He becomes a priest in 1506, and he reaches similar conclusions in Switzerland that Martin Luther did in Germany. Now, as a priest, he focused on the New Testament, specifically Paul's letters. In 1518, he gets invited to be the people's preacher in Zurich, Switzerland. He makes the New Testament a central part of his church service, so no more Latin masses. Now you're going to get a message preached to you in the language you speak. He attacks corruption. He attacks what he views as the false doctrines of Catholicism, such as purgatory, the veneration of saints, monasticism, the authority of the Pope, fasting, priestly celibacy. Zwingli said, "I would rather share the eternal law of a Socrates or a Seneca than that of a Pope." So Socrates and Seneca, famous Greek and Roman philosophers, they didn't know who Jesus was. They weren't Christians, but they were better people than the Pope, according to Zwingli. Zwingli protested Bernhard Samson. He was kind of the Tetzel of Switzerland. He was selling indulgences, and Zwingli opposed him much like Luther did. Zwingli saw indulgences as he called them a lucrative business for its authors. It's basically a way for the Catholic Church to make money, not really care about people's souls. Zwingli gets married in 1525. In 1523, Zurich has this debate. The Great Council of Zurich invites Zwingli and some Catholics to debate. Zwingli writes 67 theses and basically spells out his version of Protestantism. The Council of Zurich takes Zwingli's side. They order priests to only preach what's in the Bible, not church tradition, not what the Pope says, only stuff that's scripturally based can be taught. And things start to change in Zurich after Zwingli. Priests marry, baptism is done in the vernacular, not in Latin. The Mass is neglected. The veneration of images is abandoned. So a lot of things change. Zwingli writes pamphlets and books laying out his doctrine. He agrees that salvation is through faith and not good works. Purgatory is a figment. It's created by the Catholic Church. Only God can forgive sins, not priests. And he says the Eucharist is symbolic. And I want to say here, this is an area where Zwingli and Luther disagreed. So the Catholic view of the Eucharist, that communion, bread and wine that you take, the Catholic view is that the priest consecrates it, and that literally puts the body and blood of Jesus in the communion bread and wine. Now, Martin Luther said Jesus is present, but not because the priest consecrates it. He's just there. And then Zwingli said Jesus is there in spirit, but it's a remembrance done to remember Jesus dying on the cross. He's not literally there. You do this as a symbol to remember what Jesus did for you. Now, a lot of people thought, hey, Zwingli and Luther have a lot of the same ideas. Maybe we could get them together and they could agree on things. So they do have this meeting in 1529. It's called the Marburg Colloquy. It's an attempt to unite Zwingli and Luther. They do agree on 14 statements. So, like the faith alone doctrine, the idea that indulgences are corrupt. They agree on that, but they can't agree on the Eucharist and some other things. So Zwingli and Luther never team up. Eventually, civil war comes to Switzerland, much like it kind of did in Germany. In the 1520s, you have Catholic provinces fighting Protestant provinces. Eventually, Zwingli is killed in battle. He was wounded on the battlefield. Some Catholics came over to him and asked if he wanted to renounce Protestantism and accept Catholicism, and he couldn't talk because of his wound, but he signaled that he didn't, so one of the Catholic soldiers killed him. Eventually, the same agreement reached in Germany is reached in Switzerland. This province becomes Catholic, this province becomes Protestant, and it's kind of left at that. Now, John Calvin, he's more famous than Zwingli. Some people argue he's more famous than Luther. I still think Luther is the most famous Protestant reformer, but some people rank John Calvin above him. He's French by birth, but because he has to flee to Switzerland, because he's persecuted in France, he's known more with Switzerland. France remains Catholic throughout this whole thing. France remains Catholic. Spain remains Catholic. Um, Now, Calvin's very well educated. He studied theology at Paris, at the university, and at the University of Orleans. He studies law. He becomes a Protestant in the 1530s. He's just about to become a Catholic priest, and he realizes that he agrees more with Protestantism, and that's when he flees to Switzerland. His greatest contribution was the Principles of the Christian Religion in 1536. Basically, he argued that God is completely sovereign. Um, People are saved by faith and grace, not good works. He says the Eucharist is symbolic. He talks a lot about the obedience to God's law. You can't violate God's law. He has something known as the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. He basically talks about if you are going to rebel, this is how to do it. I'm not going to get into it, but he has a way. His big idea, though, is predestination. That's what John Calvin is known for, is predestination, and you should remember that. I want to read a quote from John Calvin. He says, "Predestination we call the eternal decree of God, by which he has determined in himself what he would have become of every individual. For they are all not created with a similar destiny, but eternal life is foreordained for some, and eternal damnation for others. To those whom he devotes to condemnation, the gate of life is closed by a just and irreprehensible but incomprehensible judgment. How exceedingly presumptuous it is only to inquire into the cause of the divine will, which is in fact and is justly entitled to be the cause of everything that exists. For the will of God is the highest justice, so that what he wills must be considered just, for this very reason, because he wills it." So basically, John Calvin believes that because God knows everything, he knows whether you're going to heaven or hell. And because he knows, you have no free will in the matter. Now, Catholics would argue you still have free will, you still get to choose. And Martin Luther kind of came down somewhere in the middle. Eventually, Calvin goes to Geneva to help the city council enact Protestant reforms. He imposes a lot of regulations. He has a man, Michael Servetus, put to death because he denied the Trinity. Eventually, Calvin is forced to flee, but he comes back to Geneva one more time and sets up something called the Holy Commonwealth. This is basically kind of a joining of church and state. Something in the Commonwealth was set up called the consistory, and that oversaw morality. So they would have pastors go door to door and check up on your morality from time to time. People resented this. Some people liked it, but some people resented it. Calvin dies in 1564. He has great influence. He started the Genevan Academy to train preachers to spread the Protestant faith. He teaches others Greek and Latin so they can understand the Bible. John Knox, he's the one that spreads Protestantism to Scotland. He studied under John Calvin at the Genevan Academy. The Netherlands converts to Protestantism because of John Calvin. So John Calvin's influence was great. The historian Will Durant said his influence was even greater than Luther's, but he walked in a path that Luther had cleared. Now, I still think Luther's a bigger person, but others think it was John Calvin. Now, there are some radical Protestants that are known as Anabaptists. This comes from the word Vatertaufer, which means, again, baptizers. This movement started in Switzerland. Conrad Grebel had a falling out with Zwingli, and he sets out and forms his own church. Now, he's eventually arrested and executed. But what Anabaptists believe was set forth in the Schleitheim Statement in 1527. They said baptism is only for repentant adults. If you're an infant, you don't know what you're doing when you get baptized, so it has no meaning. You can only be baptized as a knowing adult. Now, Martin Luther thought infant baptism was still a good thing. He basically said it's a covenant with God that you're going to raise the child to follow God. So Martin Luther was okay with infant baptism, as were a lot of Protestants. The Anabaptists are kind of radical Protestants. And radical doesn't necessarily mean a bad thing. It comes from a Latin word radix, which just means the root. So if you're a radical, it really just means you're getting at the root of the issue. But Anabaptists also believe that you should only receive communion if you were baptized as an adult. And they're pacifists. They don't believe in bearing arms for a country or taking oaths, so they're pacifists. Some famous Anabaptists are Menno Simons and Jacob Ammon. They founded the Mennonites and the Amish religions, which are kind of offshoots of Anabaptism. The most infamous Anabaptist incident is the Munster incident. In 1534, a group of radical Anabaptists took over the city of Munster. Now, the guy that took over the city was killed, but someone took his place. That man was John of Leyden, and he ends up taking over the city. He's the Anabaptist leader. He declares himself King David of Munster. He mints coins proclaiming the reign of his kingship. He seizes people's private property. He legalizes polygamy. Some sources say he had as many as 16 wives. So basically, he kind of was a cult leader. And eventually, the city is surrounded by a Catholic army, and John of Leyden is betrayed by a couple of traitors to the Catholics. One thing the Anabaptists did is they united Protestants and Catholics. You know, despite Protestants and Catholics not agreeing on a lot of issues, they did agree that the Anabaptists were too radical. So a lot of times Protestants and Catholics worked together to crush Anabaptists. John of Leyden and some of his lieutenants, they were tortured to death. They were tied with spiked collars around their neck to a pole. They were tortured for hours with red-hot iron rods. They had their tongues pulled out with these rods, and eventually they were stabbed to death in the heart with knives that had been heated up. Their bodies were hung in cages and hoisted high up the side of St. Lambert's Church. If you look at slide 24, you can see a picture of the cages, and you can kind of see how high up it is. So it's just a reminder not to get too radical. Eventually, the Protestant Reformation also spread to England. I kind of want to talk about that. Now, the main figure around the English Reformation is Henry VIII. When Martin Luther starts the Protestant Reformation, Henry VIII actually sides with the Catholic Church. He writes something called the Defense of the Seven Sacraments. It's a response to Luther, condemning Luther. Pope Leo X is so pleased, he gives Henry VIII the title Fidei Defensor, or Defender of the Faith. So Henry's a staunch Catholic, but that will change. Now, what happened is Henry VIII had an older brother named Arthur. Arthur marries Catherine of Aragon. She's from Spain. Eventually, Arthur dies. Now, Arthur and Henry's father is Henry VII. So Henry VII is like, my one son died. I want my other son to marry Catherine. Now, there's a problem with this. There's a couple verses in the Old Testament Bible about how you're not supposed to marry, or you're not supposed to lie with your husband's your brother's wife. Sorry, you're not supposed to lie with your brother's wife. Um, so what ends up happening is Henry needs a special dispensation from the Pope, and that just means special permission to get married. And he does get one from Pope Julius II. So Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon marry. But they can't produce a male heir. They do have children, but they die in birth or in infancy. They do have a daughter, Mary. She'll be important later on. Now, Mary is betrothed to a Frenchman when she's 2 years old. So if Henry doesn't produce a male heir, his daughter Mary someday will rule with the French king over England. So it'd be kind of weird if England was ruled by France. There was also a civil war in England in the late 1400s called the Wars of the Roses. This was basically a civil war fought over the throne. So Henry VIII is kind of worried, if I don't produce a male heir, we might go to civil war again. So what happens is Henry VIII tries to get a divorce in the 1520s. Pope Clement VII has to grant him the divorce, but he won't because he's scared of Charles V. Now, Charles V is the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. So the Pope is like, if I grant Henry a divorce from Catherine, I'm going to upset Charles V. And Charles V actually had Pope Clement VII captured for a while. Charles V invaded Italy. Now, eventually, Catherine is divorced by Henry. So Henry breaks with Rome. You have something called the Reformation Parliament in England from 1529 to 1536. They pass legislation that brings the English Church under the control of the monarch, Henry VIII. So you have the Act of the Submission of the Clergy. Basically, the Church of England needs the monarch's assent to change church laws, not the Pope's permission. The Act of Supremacy, that's the big law. That makes the English monarch the head of the Anglican Church, the Church of England. So remember the Act of Supremacy. They also have the Act of the Dissolution of the Monasteries in 1536. Basically, Henry VIII confiscates church lands and gives them out to Protestant allies of his. Now, eventually, Henry falls in love with a lady named Anne Boleyn. They get married and have a daughter, Elizabeth. She'll also be important later on, but they don't produce a son. Henry charges Anne with treason and adultery, and she's executed. So Henry dies in 1547, but his 3 children are going to rule the throne of England for over the next 50 years. They are Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Before Henry VIII died, he appointed Protestant tutors for Edward VI. Edward is like 9 years old when he becomes king. So basically, he's got adults ruling for him, and they're very Protestant. So under Edward VI, the country takes a very Protestant direction. They outlaw Mass, they outlaw heresy laws that the Catholic Church enacted in England. They institute something called the Book of Common Prayer, the English Book of Common Prayer. So that's what church services use now, not Catholic books. So under Edward VI, the church goes in a very Protestant direction. Now, eventually, Edward dies. He's kind of a sickly child, and his half-sister Mary takes over. Mary is very Catholic. She's very staunchly Catholic. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was Catholic. She takes the country in a very Catholic direction. She outlaws the Book of Common Prayer. She brings back the Catholic heresy laws. She burns around 300 Protestants at the stake who won't turn to Catholicism. The place she burned them at was called the Smithfield Market. It's just outside London. So when people reference the fires of Smithfield, they were talking about the people that had been burned by Mary I. That's how she gets the nickname Bloody Mary. She takes the English church back to Catholicism. Now, eventually, she dies without an heir, so her half-sister Elizabeth I becomes Queen of England. Now, Elizabeth I, she's moderately Protestant. What she does is she reaches out to moderate Protestants and moderate Catholics and makes both of them happy. So the extreme Protestants and the extreme Catholics don't really like Elizabeth, but everybody in the middle does. She follows something called the middle way. It basically says, I'm not going to go extreme one way or the other. So the Church of England is officially Protestant, but it feels Catholic in a lot of ways. It has a church hierarchy with bishops and priests. They have formal, fancy clothing. They do Mass a lot of ways the Catholic Church does. So England still feels kind of Catholic, even though it's officially Protestant. The Act of Uniformity gets passed when Queen Elizabeth is ruling, and it says that it abolishes the Pope's authority and made Elizabeth the supreme head of the Catholic Church. Okay, so that's kind of how the Protestant Reformation took hold in England. Now in Scotland, uh, James V dies in 1553. His daughter, Mary, Queen of Scots, is too young to rule, so Mary of Guise, his wife, her mother, rules, and she cracks down on Protestantism. She's Catholic, and basically the Protestant Scottish nobles rebel. Um, England sends soldiers to help the Protestants. The French send soldiers to help the Catholics. So basically, you have rebellion in Scotland, but eventually they sign a treaty, the Treaty of Edinburgh, um, after Mary of Guise's death. Later on, Mary of Scots, Queen of Scots, gets deposed, and basically Scotland becomes a Protestant country. John Knox, who had studied under John Calvin, he comes back to Scotland and spreads Protestantism. So Protestantism spreads in Scotland. Okay, so how did the Catholics respond to all of this? There's something the Catholics have to deal with. There's two views of what the Catholics do. There's the argument that the Catholics had a counter-reformation. Basically, they had a reaction against Protestantism. It would not have happened if the Protestant Reformation had not happened. The other idea is the Catholics had their own Reformation. You know, they were concerned too with church abuses. They were concerned that the church was too focused on worldly affairs. They would have reformed even without the Protestant Reformation. Now, in 1527, you know, it's 10 years into the Protestant Reformation, hundreds of thousands of Catholics are leaving the church and becoming Protestants. Rome actually gets sacked by the troops of Charles V in 1527. Charles V had invaded Italy. A Catholic bishop has said, because all flesh has become corrupt, we are citizens not of the holy city of Rome, but of Babylon, the city of corruption. Another Catholic said, I see that our Holy Mother, the Church, had been so changed that she seems to have no tokens of her evangelical character, and no trace can be found of her humility, temperance, continence, and apostolic strength. Sebastian del Piombo was a painter, and he was going to paint a monk in the chapel at San Pietro, but Michelangelo, the great Renaissance painter, advised against it. Michelangelo said, the monks have spoiled the world, which is so large. It would not be surprising if one should spoil the chapel, which is so small. So a lot of Catholics realize there are problems going on too. There are a number of Catholic reformers, though. One of them is Francisco Cardinal Jimenez de Cisneros. He served at the Catholic Church in Rome and Spain. He was the personal confessor of Queen Isabella. She would rule Spain. He reformed the monasteries of Spain. He founded a university in Spain, the University of Alcalá. He had scholars come from all over Europe to work on a translation of the Bible. It had Greek, Hebrew, and Latin text in columns right next to each other, so you could trace kind of the different wording of the Bible. So he's all about spreading Christianity through kind of intellectual pursuits. Another Catholic reformer, Saint Filippo Neri, what he did is he focused on cultivating kind of an austere religious lifestyle. So renounce a lot of the pleasures of the world and kind of live an austere, strictly moral lifestyle. A lot of the men that he mentored in the church founded the Congregation of the Oratory. They basically focused on preaching and worshiping as best they could, teaching others how to do the same. Probably the most famous Catholic reformer is Saint Ignatius of Loyola. He was the founder of the Society of Jesus. They're known as the Jesuits. They're kind of the intellectual arm of the Catholic Church. Now, St. Ignatius was a soldier. He was a Spanish soldier. He was wounded by a cannonball in one of Spain's conflicts. So he was at a monastery recuperating, and he asked if they had anything to read. He wasn't a Christian, he wasn't Catholic, and they gave him a Bible and the lives of the saints, and he read those, and he ended up converting to Catholicism, and basically devoted his life to defending Catholicism. Eventually, the Pope recognized him. The Jesuits in 1530. In 1534, he founded the Society of Jesus, and then in 1540, the Pope recognized them as an official order. They spread Catholicism to the New World, to India, Japan, China, a lot of places in Germany that became Protestant. The Jesuits went back for Catholicism. There were a lot of women reformers. Angela Merici, she created the Ursulines order. They basically educated young girls and helped the sick. Probably the most famous female reformer is Saint Teresa of Avila. She was probably the most famous Catholic woman in the 16th century. She revitalized the Carmelites. They were a monastic order of women. They had become corrupt. They lived very luxurious lifestyles in their monastery. You're not supposed to live luxurious lifestyles in a monastery, but they did. And she kind of comes and reforms them. She wrote an autobiography of her life that's very famous. The popes got in on this reform as well. Pope Paul III, he was kind of a womanizer and a political guy, but a lot of reforms come through him. He established a reform commission to see what was wrong with the Catholic Church. He recognized the Jesuits and other religious orders. He called the Council of Trent, which we'll talk about in a minute. Another problem during this time is a lot of bishops or church officials would come from Spain or England or France or the Holy Roman Empire. They would come to do business in Rome, and then they would stay there because it's so nice in Rome. He ends up kicking a lot of these people out, and he says, you need to go back home and serve the people that you are supposed to be serving. The Reform Conference in Rome met daily for about 3 months. Paul told this Reform Conference, he says, I want you to tell us what the church did wrong. I want you to put it in writing. Sadoleto was the guy. He was a Catholic bishop or priest. He opened the conference, and he basically said, the popes have committed so many sins and crimes, and they're so greedy. That's why the church is deteriorated. So here's a pope telling this conference, this committee, to tell me what's wrong, and they basically say, you guys are wrong, the popes. So he listened to that. They published something called the Council of the Appointed Cardinals of Reforming the Church. Basically, they created a document in 1527 that said, we need more supervision of Catholic priests. We need to make sure that we have a check on dispensations. We need to stop money payments. We need higher standards. Our priests need to understand Latin. They need to be educated. We need to end priests having multiple offices but not really serving them. This advice was called the Golden Council, and they sent it all over Europe. Pope Paul IV, he ordered monks who were absent from their monasteries to return home. He was another pope. He ordered the gates of Rome shut, and anybody that was still in the city that was supposed to have gone back home, he arrested. He strengthened the Inquisition. He created something called the Index of Prohibited Books. So if you're Luther or Calvin or some other Protestant reformer, you're not supposed to read books if you're a good Catholic, because they'll fill your head full of ideas that are false. The biggest response, though, the Catholics had was the Council of Trent. They had meetings, and basically they end up meeting in 1545. And basically this is Catholics from all over Europe, and they basically reaffirm what Catholics believe, and then they say what they need to fix. So they reaffirm the Nicene Creed that was set down, over 1,000 years ago by by the church during the Roman times. They said church authority is equal to scriptural authority. The church is the sole authority in interpreting scriptures. They reaffirmed the Latin translation of the Bible. This was called the Vulgate. They said faith and good works are what save you, not just good works or not just faith. Um, they did say that heresy was caused by the sins and the abuses of the church. So they said, we're at fault for a lot of this that's been going on, this Protestant Reformation. They reaffirmed transubstantiation, the idea that the priest consecrates the bread and wine and Christ's body and blood are present. They forbid clerical marriages. They forbid priests from having concubines. If not, they're going to be punished if they get caught with one. They established seminaries to teach better Catholic doctrine. They reaffirmed the worship of what the objects represented. So they said it's okay to have stained glass windows and statues in churches. They reaffirmed purgatory, indulgences, although they changed some stuff with that. The invocation of saints was defended and refined. They formally dissolved in 1563, but that was kind of the big movement, the Council of Trent. So once again, if you look at the last slide, there's the before and after the Protestant Reformation. You can see how different areas follow a different form of Christianity now. Next time, we'll look at the religious wars and we'll kind of wrap up the Protestant Reformation.